Since inception, the Center has been very active in research on European issues and its dissemination. There are currently 17 active research projects related to the impact of COVID-19 and the broad areas of energy markets and climate change, macro finance, governance and cooperation, management, history, and law. CefES gathers scholars from different fields in economics, political science, and law with the objective of contributing to the empirical and theoretical debate on the European economy. We invite contributions from external researchers, the current center's activity or new initiatives in quality of external fellow. We also have recently started an internship and visiting program. And please visit our website for further information on all our activities. Today's workshop is the second CefES International Workshop on the Hamilton Momentum and the Future of European Integration. It's part of a joint CefES RCEC and RCA Europe scientific initiative. We are proud to carry on this initiative with the aim of connecting scholars all over the world and to strengthen their cooperation, particularly in this period of high human, social, economic, and political distress. And two key events marked 2020, the European Union lost one of its member states, the United Kingdom, and the international community faced the COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis. Developments due to the worldwide vaccination campaign, the policies enacted to foster the economic recovery, the most recent 2021 Afghan crisis, and the ongoing climate crisis do urge reflection on the future of the Union at 27 members. Recalled events may represent a step change in European history. A prompt reaction of EU institutions in these fields could transform the Union into a powerful political entity. As a matter of fact, until now, only the pandemic recessions triggered such a reaction. European Commission issued joint debt to fund the Next Generation EU program. Related financial resources have been redistributed across member states according to the depth of the pandemic recession at the national level. In this light, the pandemic turns out to be both a challenge and an opportunity for long-due structural reforms in Europe. Firstly, about rethinking the rules governing the EU's institution and its monetary and fiscal policy. Secondly, the political response needed to face the climate challenge and the transition to a carbon-free economy. And only time will tell whether these challenges represent a European Hamilton momentum in the light of the United States constitutional origins. It is the long-awaited trigger to build the European Federal Republic. And this workshop aims to kick off a new round of discussion on these most critical issues, building insights on the future of Europe beyond the current distress. And I'd like to take the chance to thank all our speakers and chairs for having made all this possible. And I would like to give the floor to Professor Claudio Martinelli of our university, the joint chair organizer of this event, for his welcome remarks. Claudio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. As I'm briefly introducing this session, I would like to say that it has been a great pleasure and honor to be involved in the organization of this meeting concerning crucial issues for the future of the European Union. And we know very well how this matter will be crucial for the development of constitutional and comparative law, constitutional theory, and constitutional history. So I would like to extend a special welcome to all our distinguished guests. Thank you very much for accepting our proposal. It will be very interesting to listen to their different point of views: constitutional comparative lawyers, political scientists, and economics scientists. Finally, let me thank Professor Monica Bonini, my researcher Simone Gianello, and my collaborator Miriam Pedruzzi for the organization of this workshop morning session. And now I immediately leave the floor to the chairman Wojciech Brodowski, professor in the University of Warsaw and visiting professor in our department, BILAB. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and good morning to
Excuse me. Okay.
Okay, I hope that helped, and I hope that everyone can hear me. So hello again, and good morning to everyone. Well, first of all, thank you to the organizers for having me here. This is both a great pleasure and a great honor. Like you said, I'm an associate professor at the University of Warsaw, Poland, and also a visiting fellow to the University of Milan Bicocca with a research project related to constitutional law, but the boundaries between the constitutional law, the EU law, and all other branches of public law seem to get blurry these days, which probably explains my presence on this panel. And it's a great panel with many renowned scholars, a panel which includes Professor Monica Bonini from the University of Milano Bicocca, Professor Sergio Fabbrini from Luis Guido Carli, Professor Otto Versman from École de Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and Professor Päivi Leino-Sandberg from the University of Helsinki. I will turn back to each and every speaker with a proper introduction before their presentations. Now, my role here will be rather limited. I don't want to be one of these chairs which flood the audience with superficial remarks after each and every presentation. I will not yield to this particular temptation. So I will just serve as your remote microphone stand, if you allow me. Now, in terms of housekeeping, we have, even if we have this slight delay, we still have lots of time, both for presentations and for a Q&A session, which will follow after the last presentation. But still, I would like to ask the speakers to keep strictly to time. There are up to 25 minutes allowed for each presentation. If you reach that limit, I will make discrete signals that you should be reaching toward the end. And now, turning to the first speaker, Professor Monica Bonini, who is an associate professor at the University of Milano Bicocca, where she teaches institutions of public law, communications law, and global banking in the degree courses in marketing, corporate communication, and global markets, economics and commerce, as well as marketing and global markets of the School of Economics and Statistics. Now you understand why I need this sheet to help me remember. She's also an external fellow of the Center of European Studies, which organizes this conference, and even more importantly, a regular visiting professor to numerous German universities and a member of the Italian Association of Constitutional Law and of the Societas Juris Publici Europei. Monica is also a great scholar and a great person, which I happen to know, as she's a great friend of mine. Her presentation for today is called Hamilton Momentum, Lessons from the Past for the European Union of the Future. And now, if you allow us, we'll switch places with Monica so that she could be caught by the camera as the conditions in which we are broadcasting are demanding. Good luck to you.
Thank you. So here I am. Good morning to all of you here in the room and everyone who is hearing us. Many thanks. Allow me just 1 minute in order to thank Claudio Morana for involving us all in this really interesting project. And my warmest thanks to all of you, and especially to, if I may, Claudio Martinelli. You placed a lot of faith in my abilities, and that's why I'm here today, and so thank you. But last but not least, to Simone Gianello, we worked a lot together in order to organize this morning session. Now, as you understand, simply hearing the names of the morning session, Professor Versman, Leino Paevi-Zandberg, and Sergio Fabbrini, I am sitting here between three giants, everyone of her or his science. Now, my talk will be, therefore, on the one hand, on the threshold of different sciences, I would say, so history, politics, economics, because of the absolute interdisciplinary character of the topic and of the issues. On the other hand, I am a compared constitutional law scholar by formation, and that's why even if I speak about historical, economic, or other topics, of course, I will reflect on a way to understand all these topics and issues in a specific frame. And the specific frame is, of course, form of government and form of state. Therefore, for me, at least, reflecting on the original American assumption of debt does not mean, at central level, does not exactly mean to reflect only on the birth of the fiscal European Union or on the banking European Union. But it means to reflect on a state building moment, and even more important, on a state building moment able to avoid social and political unrest. And specifically, if we think about the European Union, I would like to think also about, to reflect with you about the sort of strange evolution for constitutional scholars. It is really, really strange, towards cooperative supranational federalism, if I may use this specific way of describing the European Union. Now, from this specific point of view, I have to say that we are experiencing not exactly a Hamilton momentum, but a sort of, with, of course, specific European characteristics. And again, from this point of view, from the point of view I am suggesting here, there are three lessons from the past for the European future of which I think are important. The three are, and I will come back to these, the role of exogenous shocks, the importance of political decisions, and the importance of political decisions grounding on political bargains in order to give birth to extraordinary, absolute extraordinary political ambitions. Now, to proceed in an orderly manner and to use my 25 minutes maybe, and also to help our PhD students and our students to understand exactly what we're talking about. First of all, I'd like to reconstruct what the Hamilton momentum was, but beyond the legend, because we do know this momentum, but we do know the legend concerning it. Then I'd like, secondly, to understand if the Hamilton momentum is comparable to the next generation EU. And again, the next generation EU, not as we know it now, but before the Recovering and Resilience Fund. And then I'd like to identify a few profiles helping us to understand what the Hamilton momentum teaches us. And as I said, lessons from the past for the European Union of the future. Thus, in a specific frame. We know all that Jean Monnet always said that Europe needs a crisis to make important steps forward. And as we do all know, Europe is based, the European Union is based on a grand, on an immense, on an extraordinary political design. We're all dreaming of the United States of Europe. But progress in political reality, I would not say always, but certainly often, can only be achieved by overcoming obstacles. Which obstacles we will see, and in our specific story and history, under the pressure of a crisis. So, and that's why maybe politicians now, here I'm thinking about Olaf Scholz, the German finance minister, and also several scholars identify these circumstances, the next generation EU, as a Hamiltonian moment for Europe. But, as I said, to proceed in an orderly manner. What was the Hamilton momentum? The legend, the reference is, of course, to America's first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, who consolidated the war debt of the 13 colonies with the issuance of a common debt. But between here, legend and history. So the legend tells us that the compromise of 1790, of course, generally regarded as one of the most important bargains in American history. Imagine ranking just below the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850. Well, it was arranged by Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson over the dinner table at Jefferson House. This compromise, why did this compromise appear possible? Well, the compromise linked two issues which appeared possible to be linked because, on the one hand, Virginians wanted the national capital being situated on the Potomac side. But this necessity urged by the Southerners had been opposed, very successfully opposed, by Northern votes in Congress. While assumption, on the other hand, supported by a lot of Northerners at that time, had been defeated some 2 months earlier, more or less, largely by its Southerner opponents. So as you see, the situation was difficult, a stalemate. So in such occasion, you have to find an arrangement. Let's keep this in mind, because of course, certain provisions which Virginians regarded as inequitable would be modified. Madison would not vote for the capital, but he would not oppose to the amended measures. Hamilton would round up enough votes for the passage for the Residence Bill, and Jefferson and Madison would then secure enactment of assumption by persuading Virginia congressmen. At least two were the votes which were very, very important, Alexander White and Richard Brandley. So these three principles, they kept the promises, and then we arrived to the so-called Hamilton momentum. But the real story is different. The real story did not, let's say, take birth at the dinner. And Jacob E. Cook explains it in a very clear way. And I would like to quote him. One has only to read the debates of the Congress and examine the congressional roll calls in order to doubt that the agreement was responsible for the passage on the one side of the Residence Bill and on the other side of assumption of debt. So let us keep this in mind. Congress roll calls, may I translate as a compared constitutional law scholars form of government. What does the parliament do? Now, second consideration, what was the situation before the Next Generation EU? What is the background story? And here I would like to go back to the words of Ottmar Issing. He is the first chief economist of the European Central Bank, works in the Center for Financial Studies in Frankfurt. And he said that, he wrote also, that long before the COVID crisis, several initiatives were taken in the European Union to move the European Monetary Union in a specific direction, it is a fiscal union. But in this context, long before the COVID crisis, a permanent candidate was the proposal of so-called Eurobonds, to issue Eurobonds. So it was along 2020, the Italian government who proposed what? Our government proposed Corona bonds to signal the idea that no one wanted to create a permanent instrument, but a specific, a unique one for overcoming only financing problems caused by the pandemic. Now, of course, one might raise doubts as to whether even such singular act is not able to prepare the ground for, in the future, more joint liability instruments on future occasions. And the idea is, and that's why I quoted before Olaf Scholz's position, of course, we can call them Corona bonds or Euro bonds or whatever it may be, but we see that the direction has been written somehow. Now, what is important from this point of view, and from the frame, in the frame I was talking before about forms of government. the role of the Commission. We all know that the Commission, on behalf of the European Union, will borrow on the capital markets. And it is, again, the Commission which will pass the benefit onto the EU member states directly when providing them with loans or other instruments, or to the Union budget in the form of low interest rate payments and borrowings to finance recovery spending. The Commission, not states, not the Council of Heads of Government and State. And that's very important because now from this, of course, I use only a few words. One may speak here for hours of Hamilton momentum and of the next generation EU, but I wanted to have your attention on these specific issues. Now, are the Hamilton momentum and the next generation EU comparable, or even better, which lessons can we draw from the past for our future? Now, let us divide comparable elements and non-comparable elements. Comparable elements, well, the reference is based on two elements which are comparable to the situation of 1790 and the United States of America. They also, both instruments challenged what? An exogenous, symmetric shock. At that time, it was the first war of independence. Nowadays, it is the pandemic. And second, comparable element, the 13 colonies, as nowadays, not every member state, but a lot of them, and the southerners, they already had a high public debt before the crisis. So therefore, they would run a part of the 13 colonies, a part of the 27 European members, they would run, and they did run, into great difficulties in financing the measures needed to stabilize their economies once they experienced these both these exogenous and symmetric shocks. Now, that's why for Europe, for the European Union, we could speak as the neutralization of the debt as a sort of Hamilton momentum in this specific frame. And also because, well, the European Union, as a matter of fact, is providing the financial means to the countries most seriously hit by the crisis. And the comparable element with the assumption of debt is true that the European Union has broken a taboo. Has broken a taboo because the recent EU policy initiative involves, however, a sort of issuance of a new European debt, which is a novelty. It is really a novelty. So, if these are the comparable elements, which are the non-comparable elements? And here there are a lot of problems. First of all, the recent European Union policy initiative does not exactly affect existing debt. It's not an assumption of debt from the member states to the European Union. The debt remains the responsibility of every single member state. This was not the case of, and that's why we call it a Hamilton momentum. There was a real assumption of debt. Second, Hamilton's decision did absolutely not prevent individual states from continuing to issue their own debts, which were subject to distinct rules in the 13 colonies. And here we have a strange thing, because in a federal country, assumption of debt at central level, at the federal level, did not mean that the colonies could not decide their own rules regarding their own debt. In the European Union, we do experience something completely different, because member states do have, sooner or later, now we all know that the Stability and Growth Pact has been temporarily suspended, but sooner or later we'll come back to these rules. So we will have to respect strictly, not strictly, the future will say, but the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact. So from this point of view, we are more federal than the United States in 1790. And second non-comparable element, very important, well, the Union assumed the debt in the United States from states already existing, but in a real constitutional frame. the first federal constitution in the world, 1787. If we, as member states, if we as European Union do want to establish a fiscal union, we have to transfer sovereignty on taxation, on credit financing, on public spending from the national to the European level. And as far as, and of course, I have to say it again, I'm a compared constitutional law scholar. So for me, the only way to do it this should be a democratically legitimated one. This means maybe we have to think about changing the treaties in order to really be able to build a fiscal, a financial, a banking union. And what's the problem then? Of course, changing the treaties mean that the parliaments will have to ratify this change. And in some countries, another difficult step, a lot of referenda has to be done. And here we have other problems. So there's this big problem, changing the treaties, and two problems in the big problem. This means, would we have popular support? What populists who are already in a lot of parliaments here, in Italy, for example, would they like this idea? And a problem not at the level of the member states, but at the European level. Frugals would understand this way of changing the treaties as a tricky ploy in order to undermine democratic accountability concerning debt of national parliaments and governments. Would they see this change of treaties, this amending the treaties as a real concrete possibility for moral hazard for every member state? Now, this said, and in this frame, which are the lessons from the past for the future? I said before, exogenous shock, political decision, political ambition. Now, first lesson from the past. For Hamilton, the bailout was an act to cement more closely the union of the states. Thus, he did say in 1790. And translated it in 2021, this means never let a crisis go waste. Because the corona crisis could be seen as an Hamilton momentum, because this means for the first time in recent years that we are approaching problem in order to solve problems of the countries in greatest need. And translated in constitutional words, this means solidarity principle. Giovanni Pietrozella last days spoke about the solidarity principle. He's actually, he's now one of the judges of the Court of Justice. And he said, well, of course, it's not exactly the same as on constitutional national level, but anyway, we are for the first time in front of a sort of solidarity, strange as it is, because the European Union is a strange thing, starting with financial mean and not with political one. Second lesson from the past. Political decisions, they do often, if not always, ground on political bargains. The bargain was where on 4th August 1719, the US Congress, the parliament, the federal parliament, accepted Hamilton's proposal to assume the debt. And the negotiations ended in a compromise in the Congress, not at the dinner table. So this means that there must be absolutely a confrontation between who? The representatives of the people. Now, for the European Union, what is the problem from this important lesson from the past? Not exactly what we could bargain. There are a lot of things, I have not time, but there are a lot of things which we could bargain, but where we could bargain. And I would say the actual problem of the European Union is that in spite of what is written in the treaties, it developed in the last years because of the crisis of 2008 and because of this crisis too, from a supranational organization to an intergovernmental one. And intergovernmental decisions mean that you are not in a Congress with majorities. You are between the head of states and governments with a unanimity. You have to reach unanimity, which is an enormous problem, of course. And therefore, from this point of view, which European institutions have to be strengthened, and which procedures? Of course, the one giving us the possibility to do what? To decide with majorities, but with majorities. Second problem, again, a problem in the problem. It's a problem of increasing linked to this increasing intergovernmentalization. Now, do we want that our first step towards fiscal and banking union is done under certain conditions which are not the one everyone of us will understand? Taxation without representation, or better, if we think about a European Union, taxation without an effective representation, because the European Parliament doesn't do anything. It is, well, until now, that's why I'm saying that's not the supranational union of the treaties. Head of governments, head of states are deciding, not the Parliament, not exactly the Commission, but the ministers. So the intergovernmental level. Last point, political ambition. Third lesson from the past. Well, the creation of the United States, I wanted to say of European, but the European Union is the result of lessons learned from certainly a catastrophic war, but not only the Second World War. I think we have to study again. We have, and here the Professor Feldman will be of greatest importance today. We have to think, to reflect about crucial years from 1919 to 1921, because it's terrible to say, but I'm seeing, well, I'm recognizing now in the Italian situation a lot of things I read about the Weimar Republic, a lot of things. And that's why I'm afraid, and that's why I want more Europe, not less Europe. But this political ambition, this idea of a banking union has absolutely to be finalized with elements of political union. We are going the path, we should first of all have a political union and then have a financial union, in order to manage all the tensions. And I'm sorry to say it like that, COVID-19 was tragic because of the loss of lives, but it's also only strictly from these points of view, an opportunity to create this, to give the voice to these political ambitions. And that's why I think we as constitutional compared law scholars should start maybe to think, I know I'm saying something which is theoretically not exactly, but can we speak about a supranational federalist model? Can we start thinking about something like that? Because in this way, we could move the European Union from a competitive supranationalist model to a cooperative supranational federal model. Do not know if it is possible from a theoretic point of view, do not know if it is possible from a political mission. But my last point, when we do speak of forms of state, forms of government, next generation EU, political ambitions of the European Union, we have not to forget that we are speaking about the future of human beings. Future of us all, futures of the people, the Italian people, the Polish people, the Austrian people, the European people, and so on. There are a lot of moral, powerful claims which are today on the floor, and we have to face them. And I'm thinking specifically of what is happening at the boundaries of the European Union, of what is happening, is still happening in Afghanistan. So to close my few remarks, I want to go back to one of my favorite intellectuals. Thomas Mann did write in 1938, warning Europe. He asked there, has European humanism become incapable of resurrection? So the real question here is, has European Union become capable are incapable, thanks to the Next Generation EU, of political resurrection. That's it for me. Thank you.
Hi, Sergio. I see you now.
Okay, switching places again. Thank you, Monica, for this great presentation. Yes, I think it's better if we don't even touch this microphone. There was Professor Monica Bonini with lessons learned or lessons to learn from the past, the distant past, and not that distant past. And now we're moving on to the second presentation by Professor Sergio Paprini, who is full professor of politics and international relations, and who currently serves as Dean of the Political Science Department at Lewis, where he holds the Intesa San Paolo Chair on European Governance. Professor Paprini obtained the Pierre Keller Visiting Professorship Chair at the Harvard University, Kennedy School of Government. He also co-founded and served as director of the Lewis School of Government and of the Trento University School of International Studies. And the topic for his presentation, or the title of his presentation, is Reform the EU Treaties to Transform the EU into a Federal State. So without any further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the invitation. After the breadth of Monica's presentation, it would be very difficult for me to develop my argument. I would like to share with you my PowerPoint, if it's possible. Do you see it?
Yes.
Yes, we do.
I have the last title of my presentation, which is Hamilton in Brussels, the Post-Pandemic EU. And the aim of this presentation is to see whether the Next Generation EU has changed the logic, the fiscal logic of the European Union. And I will end with some critical remark. But in order to develop my argument, I start since the very beginning, defining the problem. Then I will develop a very brief analysis of the fiscal policy in the pre-pandemic EU. Then I will deal with the pandemic critical juncture, and within that critical juncture, I will discuss some elements of the Next Generation EU. And then I will look at the post-pandemic fiscal policy to conclude with a question mark. Is Hamilton now traveling toward Brussels? Okay, let's see the problem. The problem is that fiscal sovereignty is one of the few attributes of stateness. We don't need, of course, we need to always read Max Weber, and Max Weber explained that very clearly, that who control taxes in many ways control power. And here there are crucial distinctions between nation states and the process of nation state building and union of states. I use the concept of union of states in a very classical political science perspective. We distinguish, or at least I try to distinguish in my work, between federation by disaggregation and federation by aggregation. Generally speaking, we consider federalism a sort of homogeneous type of political system, which is not the case. There are federation by disaggregation. Germany of the post-Second World War, Belgium, Austria, Australia, Canada, and there are few cases successfully in democratic terms of federation by aggregation, namely previously independent member state or states deciding to aggregate in order to form a union. And this is, historically speaking, the case of the US, and Monica talked about, and the case of Switzerland. And so here I consider the union of states, not the federation as such, because the development of the question of fiscal sovereignty in federation by disaggregation like Germany or Austria is very different from the development of fiscal sovereignty in Union of States. So in Union of States, to define who has the power to collect and spend taxes is crucial. And probably around that issue, to collect and then to spend taxes, around that issue, you have the possibility to transform a Union of States in a constitutional federal system or not, or remain in a sort of ambiguous situation like the European Union. And Hamilton, as Monica explained very effectively, in 1790 decided that there was the need to transfer some of this power on fiscal sovereignty to the center without deploying, without reducing the role of the federated states. So in a way, the decision of 1790 created a sort of dual form of fiscal sovereignty, which is coherent, at least to my reading, with the dual logic of all the Union of States, namely US and Switzerland. Namely, you have the formation of two centers, at least, of sovereignty, even on the fiscal level. You have a small sovereignty in the center and the still persistent sovereignty in the states. Indeed, the states maintain that sovereignty. They use that sovereignty in a very bad way, and in the 1830 and 1840s, many of those states failed again, and this time the center did not help them to deal with their own collapse, financial collapse. So here you have this formation of a dual fiscal sovereignty. In that context, I look to the experience in Europe. And the European Union moved in a very different way than other Union of States. First, instead of to create fiscal capacity at the center, the European Union moved in the direction of fiscal regulation. So here you have a very crucial distinction between fiscal capacity to give the center an autonomous fiscal capacity to support or to intervene. Rather, in this case, the European Union moved in the direction of using the center for regulating the fiscal sovereignty of the member state. And second, this fiscal regulation was guaranteed, supported, organized by an intergovernmental governance. And in that sense, there is a combination between fiscal regulation and the fiscal governance of fiscal regulation through intergovernmental institutions. So my research question is, how did the pandemic affect this approach of fiscal regulation and intergovernmental fiscal governance? Let's go better, let's deep a little bit more on the fiscal policy in the pre-pandemic European Union. So the fiscal question emerged clearly with the 1991 decision to set up Economic and Monetary Union. I refer to the Maastricht Intergovernmental Conference. Then, of course, it became the 1992 Maastricht Treaty. But it was a very interesting debate in the Maastricht Intergovernmental Conference, where for the very first time, that happened 1 year after the unification of Germany of October 1990. So there was the need there to deal with the issue of keeping on balance Germany vis-a-vis the other country, in particularly France. So, and the decision in the conference then celebrated in the treaty was to set up an economic and monetary union, which was quite an hybrid organization. The decision was to centralize monetary policy according to the classical German model of a European Central Bank, very similar in its organization and in its internal logic to the German central bank, but decentralized economic and in this case budgetary and fiscal policy. So you have this strange system, a sort of federal centralization of monetary policy, but highly decentralized, nationalized economic and fiscal policy. Many scholars, in particular economists, in particular American economists, US economists, wrote that this system could not last. Indeed, this system had very, very significant difficulty to deal with the crisis of the 2010s. So, but of course, this decision could not be, let's say, sufficient for the German elite in particular, because to let national fiscal sovereignty without constraint could create that mechanism that Monica talked about of the moral hazard. So 1994 Stability and Growth Pact introduced constraint on fiscal decentralization. Okay, you maintain your fiscal sovereignty, but your fiscal sovereignty should be exercised within specific constraints. And those constraints were, of course, macroeconomic criteria that became a sort of constitutional criteria. So through the Stability and Growth Pact, we constitutionalized macroeconomic criteria. Instead of to constitutionalize rights, individual or social, political, collective rights, we constitutionalize, as Grimm and other scholars wrote, economics. So the responses of the European Union in the 2010 to the financial crisis increased further this logic of regulating fiscal sovereignty. So fiscal sovereignty remained formally in the member state, but it was de facto, let's say, so much regulated that the member state maintained only the formality of their own sovereignty, but not the substance of their own fiscal sovereignty. And at the same time, the 2010 responses to the financial crisis increased the intergovernmental management of the fiscal regulation. So it was the Council, the ECOFIN, the Council of Economic and Financial Ministers, and more during that crisis, it was the European Council, the main institution. So the very end, at the end of the day, we have in the Europe before the pandemic, a fiscal sovereignty which is formally preserved in the member state, but de facto it was completely curtailed. So the pandemic introduced a critical juncture in this context. It showed the inadequacy of the fiscal regulation approach. The fiscal regulation can only impose constraint, is only a negative approach, is not a positive approach. It prevents any anti-cyclical attitude. And particularly, it showed that inadequacy in a crisis which was clearly a symmetric crisis. Nobody might be considered responsible for the pandemic, although the effects of the crisis were asymmetric. In that case, it was difficult to use or to mobilize the moral hazard paradigm as the frugal coalition tried to do, in particular the Dutch prime minister as the new head of the frugal coalition in the European Union. After the Brits left, the Dutch in a way took the lead of this approach. So in a symmetric crisis, you cannot say it's up to you if that crisis destroy that part of your economy or that part of your society. So the suspension of the Stability and Growth Pact was inevitable. It showed that you cannot have those kind of rules in a situation of crisis. And when you introduce rules that are unable to deal with crisis, you are theoretically and conceptually in some trouble, because rules should live both in ordinary and extraordinary condition. but also the reliance on fiscal resources of each member state was impossible, because some of them, of the member states were much hit by the pandemic and others not. So it doesn't make any sense to blame those most hit for the pandemic. And at the same time, the intergovernmental fiscal governance did not work, because when you have distributed crisis with distributive effects, it is clear that within intergovernmental institutions, each member state leader or minister think to his own national interest. The mechanism of solidarity has difficulty to emerge in an intergovernmental institution which celebrate national interest as the guiding principle. So here, in a way, the state indebtedness, starting from Italy, Spain, but then also to other states, state indebtedness for dealing with the pandemic called for collective responsibility. You have a collective problem, you need collective solution. This is Hamilton already in the Federalist before the 1790 decision. So the next generation EU is in a way an attempt to deal with that dilemma. It gives the EU a fiscal capacity for the first time, however, within limits. Because the EU still depends on national financial transfer, which is the efficient secret of that solution I discussed before. The budget of the European Union, a very limited budget, is 1.28 of the general GDP of the Union. The budget is for 80% of the budget depends on national financial transfer. Are the member states who give the money to the European Union budget, celebrating the principle the states are the master of the treaty. So this is also the principle why you have a parliament with a very limited power in financial and fiscal policy. You have representation without taxation, exactly the opposite of what you had in the US, where you had taxation without representation. And nevertheless, this issue was never, of course, faced by the member state government. But at the same time, it was introduced the idea of Eurobond or European debt for supporting Next Generation EU. But Next Generation EU is connected to the multi-financial framework, so is in a situation in which the member state decide and the parliament need to give the consent. So this is the formation of the budget. Then, of course, within that decision, yearly divided, then the parliament start to have a voice for the use, for the expenditure of those resources. It's important in the case of the European Union to distinguish how to collect resources and how to spend resources. You have different decision-making regime regarding the former and the later steps of this process. So in a way, we have the first steps towards EU taxes, which is one of the, let's say, one of the taboo of the European Union since the very beginning. Since the 1957, there was several proposals already in the 1960s and then in the 1970s, but that point of the national fiscal sovereignty was never really challenged. And also you have the first step towards the formation of a fiscal administration. It is interesting in the research that we are doing to look at how the Commission is now dealing with the question, because the Commission has not any kind of fiscal administration. That was not a Commission institutional duty. Now the Commission, in particular for starting with the SURE, the program against unemployment, now the Commission is setting up a new fiscal administration in Brussels, which is, again, Max Weber, one of the indicator of the state building capability that we have to discuss. So the real issue for the post-pandemic fiscal policy is, will this process be contingent or permanent? I took too much time. I finish here. So here we have the question mark on my presentation, the Hamilton in Brussels. So the EU is an hybrid organization, is both supranational and intergovernmental, as I said at the very beginning. There is no way, at least to my knowledge, to consider the EU only a supranational organization or only an intergovernmental organization. The EU of the Rome Treaties, 1957, is basically a supranational organization, but is a supranational organization with the Commission, which has the monopoly of legislative power, with the two chambers, let's say, the Council and then the European Parliament, with the power to decide on a majority, different criteria of majority, the proposal of the Commission. But then, starting 1991 and the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, the Commission, the European Union developed also an intergovernmental engine. And that intergovernmental engine was the outcome of the need to deal with what we call core state power policy which were traditionally very close to the national sovereignty. So the member state decided to discuss in the second and third pillar the policy that were traditionally their own domain, but they decided to do that through highly intergovernmental organization. Here, the Commission has a very limited role, and the Parliament, notwithstanding the incredible, dramatic development of the European Parliament power, but that power stopped at the intergovernmental door. So the market is still supranational, market policy, market making, but these crucial state power policy are highly intergovernmental. And the fiscal sovereignty is an example of that. The Stability and Growth Pact, the EMU, the Fiscal Compact, the ESM are the celebration of intergovernmentalism. So to call into question this highly intergovernmental framework is very difficult. Of course, the best way to do that is, like Monica said before, to open up a discussion on the treaties. Also, today, to open up a discussion on the treaty is necessarily dangerous, because there is a growing part of the European Union, let's say, government and national population, which is becoming more and more critical of the European Union. So in any case, here you have a very consolidated framework. The pandemic called into question this framework, but could not put into crisis that framework. It showed that intergovernmentalism cannot work in condition of crisis, particularly symmetric crisis. It creates division between states already during the Eurozone. So we did the European Union to aggregate state, intergovernmentalism, or the intergovernmental governance of both the Euro crisis and now the pandemic create division between states. Remember what happened last year, the division between the frugal coalition and the solidarity coalition was very tough. It was resolved after 5 days of a dramatic European Council, and we don't know why in that solution only the member state governmental leader should be the actor. The Parliament was at the margin. The Commission played a limited role. Only then the Commission intervened in the policy-making process, transforming the political decision of the member states governmental leader in a new program. So here we have the situation where we are now. We are in the middle of a transition, probably, I don't know. You have the fiscal capacity, which enter the European Union agenda, but this fiscal capacity is exercised within limits. So the Commission has the power to allocate funds, but within specific criteria established by member state governmental leader and supervised by member state governmental leader. So it's not free, the Commission, to play an autonomous role. Also, the capacity, the technical capacity of the European Commission can give the Commission an upper hand in relation with the Council. The Parliament is still plays a secondary role. And this is another serious question that reduce the possibility of transforming that fiscal capacity in a resource for making more autonomous the center vis-a-vis the state. Nevertheless, there is a step forward, and there is an attempt to identify some form of supranational fiscal governance. So what will happen, it depends on political relation, political process, and in many cases from the success of the Next Generation EU, and Italy is very important for guarantee that success. If Italy, which is the larger beneficiary of the funds, would be successful, probably it will take one argument out of those who are against this approach. But anyway, we are in a terra incognita, and nevertheless, some of us think that probably Hamilton might buy a ticket for going from Washington DC to Brussels, and that would be a very good outcome of this crisis. I try to discuss some of these issue in this book of mine that was published a few years ago. Thanks very much. Sorry I was too long, 25 minutes. No, I was in time. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bonini, for this brilliant and perfectly structured presentation, and also for your time discipline. There was 24 minutes from what I see, so just as prescribed. And now we're moving on to Professor Otto Persman, who is here with us. Professor Persman is Director of Research and Professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and he holds a chair in legal epistemology, legal ideologies, and the great transformation of law. He has published extensively on constitutional process, theories of interpretation, the question of normative hierarchies, and the nature of judicial opinions. Professor Persman has also been a visiting professor to several foreign universities in Europe, in the US, and in Japan, including the University of Oxford and the Cardozo School of Law in New York. And the title of his presentation for today is The Process of European Integration and the Protection of its Fundamental Values in the Light of Next Generation EU. Professor Persman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and my gratitude, of course, goes first to the organizers of this event, which makes me very happy to have the opportunity to be back in Milan, even if very surrealistically, it requires me to talk English in Italy. However, so I was asked to reflect upon the problems which we have already been touching in these previous excellent presentations in the light of the fundamental values of the European Union. However, in the first part, I shall briefly revert to the difference between the Hamilton moment and the present situation before going to envisage 3 different solutions and telling you, perhaps in the discussion, my own preference. Now, Alexander Hamilton had to defend what was not evident to President George Washington, in consideration of the objections made by Jefferson, Madison, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph against his bill of a first, namely a first national bank, and the question whether this was within what the Constitution called. And so he stated at that point his theory of implied powers. Now let me briefly give the floor to Alexander Hamilton, who has just traveled from Brussels to Milan. And this is what he has to say. The truth is that difficulties on this point are inherent in the nature of the federal constitution. They result inevitably from a division of the legislative power. The consequence of this division is that there will be cases clearly within the power of the national government, others clearly without its powers, and the third class, which will leave room for controversy and difference of opinion, and concerning which a reasonable latitude of judgment must be allowed. But the doctrine which is contended for is not chargeable with the consequences imputed to it. It does not affirm that the national government is sovereign in all respects, but that it is sovereign to a certain extent, that is, the extent of the objects of its specified powers. It leaves, Hamilton continues, therefore, a criterion of what is constitutional and of what is not so. The criterion is the end, to which the measure relates as a mean. If the end be clearly comprehended within any of the specified powers, and if the measure have an obvious relation to that end, and is not forbidden by any particular provision of the Constitution, it may safely be deemed to come within the compass of the national authority. There is also this further criterion which may materially assist the decision. Thus, the proposed measure abridge a pre-existing right of any state or any individual. If it does not, there is a strong presumption in favor of its constitutionality, and slighter relations to any declared object of the Constitution may be permitted to turn the scale. So far, Alexander Hamilton at the end of the 18th century. The Hamilton momentum, which could also be labeled now the Keynesian term, or the Keynesian, term in European economic and financial politics, is undoubtedly one highly important step in European integration, allowing for shared debts, structuring repayments and distribution of grants and loans over time. The sanitary crisis, with its many phases of political and legal exceptions, seems to trigger an unprecedented step and leap in quality with respect to common solidarity across many years to come. At least that's what we all hope. It reminds us of the importance of the establishment of this central bank in the United States, able precisely to take debts and repay it. This should, however, not be overstated. Both the first and the second Bank of America had no exclusive competence on national currency. The Federal Reserve Act was enacted and signed only in 1913, more than 120 years after Hamilton's foundation of the first bank, and it required an important decision of the Supreme Court, as we know, McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, to clearly determine that the Federation could indeed establish such a bank in virtue of the implied powers granted by the Constitution, and that the states are not entitled to encroach upon such legally exercised competences. There are some main and one, in my view, decisive differences with respect to the European situation as it unfolds since the Maastricht Treaty. But there is also one common but rather preoccupying common element. On the one hand, when the issue came about in America, the several states were already united, had a constitution which had replaced the Articles of Confederation, and the organs instituted by this legal instrument were already working. There was a Congress, there was a president, there was a federal judiciary with a Supreme Court. The Constitution, in both its immediate objects and its more far-reaching scopes, had been fiercely debated before and after approval. One may even wonder why it needed an entire century to centralize both Treasury and Federal Reserve after the Republic had been adopted as a common legal frame. The effort, which has to be addressed, was a past and a future war with the former colonial home country, not a natural catastrophe and not the urgency of saving the planet. On the other hand, the common element with the present situation consists in the fact that those same states considered themselves to have retained some kind of sovereignty, which could at any moment be brought back into play. They felt that the Constitution itself was premised on an implicit compromise which the federal entity should in no way violate. Slavery had to be protected despite the preamble's famous promise to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And the famous wording of the Declaration of Independence: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, but they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It needed indeed 80 more years, a civil war, and a refoundation with the 13th and 14th Amendments in order to overcome this implicit meta-legal compromise and bring the Constitution in accordance with its extra-constitutional promise. In the European Union, we face the rather surprising situation that member states who had longed for membership and were actually warmly welcomed after re-entering the family of liberal constitutional democracies and who had explicitly accepted the founding principles of the European legal order now try to challenge precisely those principles and vindicate a sovereignty, the limitation of which they had clearly accepted according to the requirements of the treaties and the case law of the European Court of Justice. Where the Union sets an astonishingly courageous act of shared solidarity with next generation, it also faces a structural crisis in which its very values are set into structural doubt and anxious discussion. With a decision from the Constitutional Court openly challenging the primacy of EU law, Poland defies explicitly principle which other courts already potentially questioned on other occasions. And Hungary voices a possible exit from the Union, as did Britain before the Brexit referendum, even though officially declaring that the issue was not on the table. The potential crisis is itself in a strange deadlock. Hungary and Poland accepted the multi-annual financial framework on the condition that the conditionality regulation would be limited to its strictly fiscal object, as if all member states were sharing the same views, where they are entirely divided, except of course for getting the promised money. This highly complex situation seems difficult to bring in accordance with the so-called fundamental values of the European Union, as stated in Article 2 of the treaty. How can the next generation agenda be a step forward in integration through solidarity and leave the fundamental values of European integration out of scope, even in the regulation concerning the conditionality of participation in the next generation agenda. Or, to put the question more radically, are the fundamental values of the Union really values, and are they fundamental? Three possible answers may be developed. The Harmony Thesis. There is an accordance between values and order normative standards in EU law, and the next generation agenda is a new step which concretizes the potential of Article 2 Treaty European Union. Second, the weakness thesis. Besides exceptional and unlikely circumstances, Article 2 and other provisions relating to values in EU law are deprived of any efficiency. And third, the limitation thesis. Even though Article 2 may prove to have bite, the problem of a real European momentum is outside the present treaty framework. So let's move to the first thesis. The Harmony Thesis seeks to get the best out of the present legal structure. This interpretation relies on philosophical and legal arguments, where the legal arguments are themselves based on hierarchical conceptions and other ones stemming from the method in which the ideas laid down in Article 2 have been fleshed out in EU law. The harmony conception is close to the philosophy of Ronald Dworkin, for which legal argument is always to show a legal order in its best light, in order to develop its full moral potential. Other attempts have been made, notably by Jürgen Habermas or Jacques Derrida, not to forget John McCormick, not to confuse with legal theorist Neil McCormick and his conception of Europeanism, all drawing on the idea that there are some principles shared by all Europeans, or at least European states, and largely opposite to an American understanding of the Commonwealth under law, setting liberty above the state and the law at its service, whereas Europe would be driven by a commitment to a strong state and a high degree of social solidarity, limiting but not excluding economic freedom and initiative. At the legal hierarchical perspective, the argument mainly aims at showing that Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union is not only located at the highest normative rank in original treaty law, but that this position also permeates the whole legal order. As a primary norm of EU law, Article 2 in this conception constitutes a norm of reference for any preliminary ruling according to Article 267, Treaty on Function of the European Union, and even though Article 7 strongly limits sanctions with respect to a breach of Article 2, other questions may present a relation to these exigencies, and judges may decide appropriately. The Commission, as guardian of the treaty, legality, has acted accordingly. Still, the Harmony Thesis goes. The most far-reaching theory in this respect may presently be held by Armin von Bogdanly, who proposes to reverse the famous German Solange doctrine, holding now that national guarantees may apply only as long as, Solange, European fundamental values under Article 2 are not at stake, but that if such a hypothesis were verified, national judges have to act as European judges, strictly applying the Charter of Fundamental Rights and even sanctioning criminally other judges not complying with its basic requirements. The interesting point in this conception, if one tries to systematize it, consists precisely in the fact that recent legal adjustments seem indeed to improve the abstraction and vagueness of the wording of Article 2. The conditionality regulation provides for a much more concrete definition of what has to be considered an element of the rule of law. And these elements have to be complied with when implementing the financial procedures related to next generation European Union. These constructions have to meet two fundamental objections. First, on a philosophical level, the question is precisely whether the morally theorized values are fit, whether they fit into a coherent moral and political theory, whether the list suggested is both socially verified and legally concretized. And of course, these are three different questions, each of which requires methodologically neat answers. Whereas the so-called philosophical argument either rests in the sphere of a merely moral abstract argument, or is sociologically not proven, nor does it exactly correspond to present European positive law, at least with a sufficient degree of precision. On top of it, the very concept of value is not clearly defined, and its applicability to legal contexts is by no means established. At the legal level, the position held by Harmony partisans may again be ideologically optimistic. Whether all elements of the EU plus member states' legal order constitute a coherent system is an open question. And it remains doubtful whether stretching the clauses establishing the respective competence of the Union and its member states with respect to the Charter will just be in accordance with one possible legal development, or produce an effective new legal structure, or whether it will trigger fierce opposition. In any event, the idea that one has to go beyond the present distribution of competences cannot serve to show that the present legal frame is harmonious and developing into something even better. Now, to the second thesis, the weakness thesis, underscores what the Harmony thesis aims at overcoming. The fact that the values enshrined in the highest legal standards of EU law are in fact legally deprived of strict concretization procedures, except in the unlikely hypothesis that there is no member state other than the one under scrutiny, considering that one and only one member state's values qualified as fundamental. In fact, and in all other scenarios, the mechanisms laid down in Article 7 makes possible violators of Article 2 judges in their own case, producing a perverse alliance of those who breach the principles and help each other against any sanction, therefore weakening the very idea of legally sustaining the rule of law as enshrined in the treaty. Furthermore, the Article 7 mechanism constitutes even technically a step back. The very idea of constitutionalism as a legal method consists in substituting political conflict with legal procedures. This is what happened with constitutional justice as a technique of transforming conflicts of power over rights into a legally identifiable and solvable questions conferred to specialized courts, in many cases also competent to deal with criminal liability of highest organs in order not to expose them simply to popular or even parliamentary vengeance. Conceptually, this is a constitutive element of the rule of law as against the power games of men. By leaving the decision as to whether the most fundamental values of the Union have been violated to a unanimous decision of the European Council, the treaty legally politicizes the problem of compliance with the rule of law, which is obviously the state of positive law, but of positive law entangled into a legal paradox. If the Union values compliance with legal procedures applied by independent and impartial judicial organs, it cannot attribute the question of the violation of this legal principle to an organ which is by definition neither judicial, nor independent, nor impartial. But even before we come to this point, the weakness thesis can easily question the very construction of Article 2 at the conceptual level. Values are not legal data. Legal norms may comply with values as something which is considered as in itself preferable by someone cognitively competent in this respect. values express attitudes towards states of the world, which may be considered to present the quality of being preferable as an objective or a simply subjective attraction according to either non-cognitivist and emotivist or, on the other hand, moral realist theories of value. A legal text can hardly decide this difficult philosophical question, simply because the only thing it can possibly do is require, prohibit, or authorize a set of actions. What is called values in the treaty is in fact at best a set of norms of high generality, abstraction, vagueness, and indeterminacy. And again, this is highly paradoxical when addressing the issue of the rule of law. The rule of law requires conceptually that legal norms be at least sufficiently precise to be complied with to a satisfactory degree of judicially analyzable obedience. If the formulation of these norms is itself too vague and undetermined, the requirement of its own standard can hardly be met. This leads to a second problem. If the higher norm is vague and undetermined, it has at least to set how and by whom it may be made more precise and determined. For instance, by stating, according to a regulation enacted by qualified majority, member states have to comply with the principle of the rule of law in the application of the treaty. Just an example of a possible wording. In fact, the organ lastly to be competent under Article 2 in order to concretize the requirements of the rule of law and other fundamental values is the European Council when judging on the question of a violation of these principles. Now, the Union legislator took this competence for himself by enacting the conditionality regulation, which defines what the treaty left undetermined. Does this mean that other organs, namely the European Court of Justice, would have to apply the legal definition set forth with respect to the financial implementation and leaving aside the compliance with anything else than this financial aspect of next generation to other questions than the financial aspect of handling the resources mobilized by next generation? That would make a lower and specific norm prevail on what the construction aimed at excluding from judicial review. The weakness thesis has unfortunately then some plausibility. The whole generosity of the multi-annual financial framework and next generation design is not legally related to the implementation of what the treaty purports to be the most important of its legal exigencies. It is generous, it may help to overcome the disastrous social and economic consequences of the present crisis, but it hinges largely on its own value, i.e. generosity, and will not help, except in one other paradoxical hypothesis, to strengthen the weakness of the Union's fundamental principles. These considerations have to meet the following objection. Even though the rule of law may not strictly speaking, be enhanced by next generation EU, this does not mean that there are no more concrete norms implementing the first principles. This objection has to be conceded, but it does not affect the main point. Indeed, many norms in the treaties may be analyzed as concretizations of the requirements laid down in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. But if this is indeed the case, it exists independently of next generation, and next generation will not be helped by Article 2, nor does it help directly next generation, nor does Article 2 help next generation, as the conditionality is limited to procedural aspects of the distribution of loans and grants already accepted, not to their attribution itself, which follows the submission of projects and its acceptance, and not the scrutiny of whether a member state deserves a grant or a loan with respect to its compliance with the rule of law. The paradoxical hypothesis, which would undo the weakness scenario, would materialize if an organ of the Union, mainly the European Court of Justice oversteps its competences and starts reviewing and condemning member states for breach of the rule of law and sanctioning them by withholding the loans and grants to which they would otherwise be entitled. This may be helpful for the supreme principles of union law, but it would itself constitute a breach of the rule of law, which minimally requires strict observance of the distribution of competences amongst organs of the legal order. As to our main problem, and I turn to the third and last hypothesis, the limitation thesis, i.e. the relation of a generous recovery setting and to the capacity of assuming common debts to a possible Hamiltonian momentum of the Union, interpreted as a step bringing the Union further towards a truly federal entity, one has thus to face this limitation thesis. The Union certainly succeeded in mobilizing some hitherto unknown shared solidarity with respect to unprecedented crisis. It did certainly neither succeed nor even intend to make a step forward towards a structurally higher integration in strictly legal terms. In strictly legal terms, the competence of competence still lies in the hands of the member states as masters of the treaties and in the hands of the European Court of Justice as master of the judicial concretization of the competences already conferred to the Union, i.e. the dynamite of frustration with a court whose masters are unable to master its jurisprudence and a profoundly divided family of states unable to overcome the illusions of sovereignty. In this scenario, Hamilton's words still resonate as a warning. Implied powers in a union is much less satisfactory than implied powers in an already constitutionally set federation, even if there is a large amount of money to distribute and to repay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Persman, for bringing some troubling questions into daylight. And right now we're moving on to our last presentation for today. This will be Professor Päivi Leino-Sandberg, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. Professor Sandberg is here with us. She is Professor of Transnational European Law at the University of Helsinki and the Director of its Master's Program in Global Governance Law. She's also Deputy Director of the Erik Kastren Institute of International Law and Human Rights, where she currently leads or acts as Principal Investigator for 4 international research projects, including Reconnect. And the title of this presentation will be Next Generation EU and its Constitutional Ramifications. The floor is yours. Up to 25 minutes.
Thank you very much. And let me try to share my screen first. There. Good. Thank you very much for the invitation and letting me join you online. This is now, of course, a view of someone from a much feared frugal state, but also a view of someone who has been quite integrated in the constitutional debate here in Finland. Obviously, Next Generation EU has been vastly debated in the EU, actually finally brought forward a discussion about the EU and its future, which I actually have seen as a very useful debate. Personally, I feel I am much in favor of fiscal integration, however, very worried about the way in which it has happened in this context. So let me first start with outlining my main argument. Next Generation EU is a big thing. It's huge, even though I might not perhaps quite compare it with the Hamiltonian moment, and I will come back to that question later. Next Generation EU, of course, in institutional language and in particular among institutional lawyers, is very much explained as an exceptional measure. It's justified with reference to the pandemic. However, the way I see it is that Next Generation EU is not a crisis measure. Instead, it realizes institutional ambitions that have been there basically in every authoritative institutional document about EMU development during the past 10 years, which have often referred to the setting up of a fiscal capacity in one way or another. However, in these documents, these types of moves have generally been deemed legally and politically impossible. And this is the change that I wish to discuss today. Next Generation EU, it also represents a major constitutional shift. Even though it's not based on a treaty change, it does change the reading of EU law. And this, I think, will be a permanent change. And I will discuss these elements of this constitutional shift in detail in a moment. In this way, it also illustrates a much broader trend, which in fact we've seen now, in particular during the past 10 years or so, and in particular in the context of EMU development. The Lisbon Treaty, which entered into force for a bit over 10 years ago, it included very strong provisions for treaty change with the aim of ensuring that treaty change happens in a democratic manner. So lengthy procedures involving not only parliaments, but civil society, citizens in a broader manner. However, as Sergio, I think, mentioned, of course, there is a very generally felt experience that treaty changes are dangerous. We should not engage in them because the outcome might actually be that if parliaments and citizens actually engage in debating the EU, the outcome might be that whatever the institutions deem necessary will not be approved. So for that reason, changes are introduced through not treaty change, but reinterpretation, reinterpretation which in practice means it is subject to very limited democratic safeguards, very limited constitutional scrutiny, and this is something that worries me. In particular, because as a European lawyer, professor of European law, what I and all my colleagues around Europe teach at law schools is that the EU, what it makes it specific is that it's reliant on the law. On the treaties, law is very specific, it's special, because that's where the EU derives its powers. So the question there becomes, is this type of development in the EU, is it enough for the EU as a community of law? Now, what changed? I have two slides about this. And many of these elements have actually already been touched upon, but I will elaborate a little bit more. Now, as regards distribution, we have a very new and unique combination of two elements which build on the idea of emergency and a new type of use of cohesion policy instruments, which both are new developments in the EU. The outcome basically is that we set up a very large scale, nearly unconditional redistribution system of public money among the member states. And what is, I think, important to note is that the money actually, it doesn't, unlike in federations in general, it doesn't go to sort of federal aims, common goods in that sense, but it goes to matters that would usually and have always so far been financed from national budgets. So in a way, federal money used for aims at national level. The way in which this was made possible is by using an emergency clause, Article 122. So basically by saying this is a special emergency. However, the substance of this package doesn't really match with this idea of emergency. It's not really tied to anything that would have to do with the pandemic. Instead, in substance, Next Generation EU is actually concerned with the fundamental problem of economic disparities within the EU. And of course, economic disparities within a federal structure is not unusual. All federations deal with this problem. And there is also a broadly felt experience from federations that this isn't a question that is highly political. It's very divisive. It tends to be tremendously contested, who pays and who receives. And for that reason, it usually is a part of a sort of foundational constitutional settlement that you find in federal constitutions. The EU constitution, the treaties, has some elements in regard. It has the no bailout clause, for example. It has provisions on transfers in certain area, but Next Generation EU does not really build on those provisions at all. It changes their reading as well. The effects on this competence is, I think, twofold. It expands the use of this emergency provision, sort of developing it more into a sort of super competence, which can be used with relatively little connection to any crisis. We've seen new proposals in this direction coming even after Next Generation EU. And of course, with time, this emergency connection will also become unnecessary because as of now, fiscal measures are already a part of the toolkit. This is a development that I'm concerned about because as a sort of specific emergency method, it doesn't provide any role, for example, for the European Parliament. It's a typical sort of emergency empowerment that many constitutions use. But as such, in my view, it should not be used to make permanent changes because parliamentary contribution is non-existent. And then the second element is that it introduces a completely new reading of cohesion policy. Cohesion policy, which was used as a part of the toolkit for one reason, and that one reason was to avoid conditionality. Conditionality has always been a central political and legal requirement when building on the emergency clause. But now, since building instead the distribution on cohesion policy, it can be done without conditionality whatsoever. And in practice, this turns this into a vehicle that can be funded to fund basically anything but defense or bank support. Then the bigger, maybe even bigger change that Next Generation EU is concerned with has already been mentioned. It's the question of borrowing for spending. And that, of course, has been, I think, actually received fairly little attention among lawyers. Economists, on the other hand, have discussed this much more. And here, I think the change is remarkable in the sense that I think there was no one who had any doubts in the past about whether the EU could borrow to fund its policies. I have two screenshots here on this slide, one from the website of the European Commission, the other one from the website of the European Council and the European Council, which I took and saved sometime before the Next Generation proposal arrived. And on both of these websites, you see very clearly the idea that the EU treaties do not allow the EU to borrow for spending purposes. It is illegal under the EU treaties. So very sort of broadly shared understanding that in order to build instruments that would require the EU to borrow for spending on its policies, the treaties would need to be changed. However, the treaties did not change. Basically, the only thing that fundamentally changed, I think, was the position of Angela Merkel and the idea that we should find a way to circumvent these treaty provisions. The consequence then, of course, as has been already mentioned, is that now the EU has a mandate to incur massive amounts of debt. But this happened actually without any decision on how to repay the debt. That is a matter that the institutions will come back to and discuss later. So we borrow, but we have no decision on how the repayment should be done. And for that reason, for me, this doesn't really demonstrate a very stable constitutional turn. The European Council conclusions, they basically pave the way for a number of new own resources. This is not a legal problem. New own resources can be introduced. However, I think for political integration, it's a very big point. I see that as a very positive development in the sense that new own resources could be ideally something, for example, to be debated in the context of European Parliament elections. It would be a good sort of democratic moment to discuss what kind of new own resources should be there and what they should be spent on, what kind of European goods. However, I did not particularly appreciate the way in which this discussion now emerged through a sentence in the European Council conclusions. This is a matter worthy of a very fundamental European debate. At the same time, Next Generation EU represents a major power shift also from the parliaments to the executive. It is constructed as an extra budgetary tool in a way circumvent a lot of the treaty provisions. And that means, and in practice, the money placed in this extra budgetary vehicle outside the EU budget also escapes annual budget negotiations, affecting fundamentally the role of the European Parliament. Then the European Parliament has been involved basically in the formulation of the criteria in the legislative procedure. However, I think we need to note the criteria are very general. They set very few limits on how the money is spent. It can be spent on health, education, social employment services, you name it. These are the policy areas included in the national plans provided by the member states. And here we also see the big change relating to conditionality. The idea that, my understanding at least, is that the plans have very genuinely been drafted at national level by the member states, thinking about policies that they would wish to fund. The role of the EU institutions has been minimal, basically just a sort of healthy scrutiny check at the final stages. The ball is very much in the corner of the member states, which does in a way constitute also a high risk gamble, in the sense that if things go wrong, then it will be tremendously difficult to convince northern states that this is the model that should be continued. Overall, I think the structure dilutes parliamentary power. It's not a very good model for future fiscal integration in any way. It's very, very executive dominated, which usually when budgets are concerned, these areas tend to be an area where parliaments have a very strong role. Now, I would want to say a few words about how this change took place. This is related to a book that I published in September, where I describe the processes in which these reinterpretations take place. And the key players in these types of procedures, they are the legal advisors that work within the EU institutions. I've made a lot of interviews in these institutions, and they describe that basically in these processes, what they see as their task is to promote a European interest. This takes place basically through risk assessment, where they generally try to sort of anticipate questions where annulment actions could be brought against the institutions, and then the subsequent risk that the European Court of Justice might actually annul the measure. This is a risk that generally can be considered quite low, and I'll come back to that in a moment. In addition to this sort of legal drafting taking place within the institutions, of course, many of decisions of this type have been taken in the European Council after midnight with leaders that are very tired, and many of whom actually operate under very limited parliamentary control. And then my question would be, is this a place for solid constitutional change? Is this a setting where you can have enough of debate about consequences, risks, and responsibilities, which in my view would need to be there when you're talking about constitutional changes? One element of this discussion is, of course, the question of whether this is a tool that should be considered as permanent or exceptional. And there, of course, you see a clear difference. There are different discussions going on in different parts of Europe. And I think these are two tweets that actually demonstrate this dual debate about the nature of Next Generation EU. Legally, obviously, this is a one-off thing. That's the way it's been drafted. However, of course, the funding model that it introduces is not. And when approving this package in Finland, this was actually the biggest concern that the Finnish parliament had. And in response to this very broad public debate in Finland, the commissioner in charge, Valdis Dombrovskis, actually tweeted in fluent Finnish, which I admire, that it's obvious for the commission that this is a one-off, unique, strictly limited instrument that will never be repeated again. However, what was immediately noted in public debate was that the same commissioner had actually appeared before the European Parliament Committee just the day before, and in that hearing had stressed that the Commission is already looking into options into making this instrument a permanent feature of EU funding. Of course, illustrating that whatever is said about the instrument depends on the audience and what the audience wishes to hear. Legally, as I said, this is a one-off instrument, but of course, it does create a presumption that has been very relevant for funders as well, namely that when things go rough, the EU will come to rescue. This is a change that has not been constitutionalized. However, if it's not true, if this presumption will not hold, I think it will have financial effects at some stage. And this obviously is a question that the EU will need to return to. There are very different presumptions on its nature on different parts of Europe. Now, as regards the constitutional scrutiny of this change, obviously this instrument has now been approved in the own resources decision procedure. It is one of the heavier decision-making procedures in the EU, but it's not one that would transfer competence in a permanent manner, nor does it guarantee parliamentary scrutiny in all states. And then an additional element, of course, is that in the EU system, we have a court, the European Court of Justice, which is there basically to monitor that the institutions stay within the powers that have been allocated to them under the treaties. However, a discussion that is strongly emerging among constitutional lawyers like myself, is that the Court of Justice that we have today is no longer a particularly activist court. It's a court that is increasingly reluctant to scrutinize matters that are highly political, matters that are decided in the European Council, and it's a very passive court in relation to matters that relate to national competence. And for that reason, we now have an increasing discussion and position-taking in national constitutional bodies about their role in, let's say, gray zone operations like this one, operations where the institutions are genuinely navigating new waters, where legal questions can be raised, where there are, I think, justified questions about whether the EU is going a bit too far this time. These bodies, they engage seldom, they usually engage late, and in the EU structure, their involvement is almost always perceived in negative terms. But it does bring forward a big constitutional question about the court and its role in providing credible constitutional control, and the question of whether, in cases like this, the institutions really should be left to settle the limits of their own competence quite effectively. So this is my final slide, and this is where I want to finish. Basically, the way that I see it is that Next Generation EU, it is the most important constitutional change in the EU in the past 10 years, or even more than that. In the context of the pandemic, I think solidarity was absolutely necessary. However, legally seen, there would have been many alternative ways. You could have constructed a very significant solidarity instrument based on interpretations that would have been much easier to reconcile with the EU treaties. This is an instrument where a particular choice was made, a choice that will have consequences, that will bring about risks, and will also bring about responsibility. And my worry there is exactly this. We have so different understandings of the meaning of this instrument that problems are likely to emerge on this in the future. I've also been thinking a lot about the role of lawyers. I mean, lawyers, of course, especially among economists in general, are considered a bit of a pain, in the sense that often say what should not be done instead of saying what could be done. However, I would think when big things like this happen, lawyers' role should also be to remind a little bit about procedures and also engage with matters critically. However, many European lawyers actually do identify with the European project very strongly, and sort of tend to think that whatever steps are taken towards granting new powers on the EU institutions is a good thing. However, I would think there are always alternative ways of doing things that are worthy of consideration. Overall, this is a discussion that brings forward big questions about the role of EU treaties. I mean, here we have seen tremendously creative legal drafting. We have seen drafting that clearly circumvents foundational principles in the EU treaties. And this is not just my own innovation, it's just that this is a conception that was shared by the institutions themselves as well. And this brings me to question how these types of changes should take place. Sort of constitutional change is not just about updating a web page, deleting text on the internet, which is inconvenient after some political changes have taken place, or tweeting whatever explanation might suit a particular constituency. And it should also not be just about Angela Merkel changing her mind about what is a good idea for Europe at this particular point in time. Constitutional change, when it happens, it should appear unbiased. It should be something that stands public scrutiny, and also something that carries beyond the imminent crisis. And I would think in many of these respects, the recent developments leave much to be hopeful. Thank you very much.